Dandavat Pranam. Namaste. All glories to Swami Maharaj Ki Jai. All glories to Om Vishnu Pad, Srila A.C. Bid Ki Jai. All glories to Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam Ki Jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Chapter 4, Canto 1, Chapter 4, Text 6. Katam alakshita puri samprapta kuru jangalan unmatamukha jadavad vicharan gaja savaye. How was he, Srila Shukadeva Goswami, the son of Yasa, recognized by the citizens when he entered the city of Hastinapur, now Delhi, after wandering in the province of Kuru and Jangala, appearing like a madman, dumb and retarded? Purport. The present city of Delhi was formerly known as Hastinapur because it was first established by King Hasti. Goswami Shukadev, after leaving his paternal home, was roaming like a madman, and therefore it was very difficult for the citizens to recognize him in his exalted position. A sage is not therefore recognized by sight, but by hearing. One should approach a sadhu or great sage, not to see, but to hear him. If one is not prepared to hear the words of the sadhu, there is no profit. Shukadev Goswami was a sadhu who could speak on the transcendental activities of the Lord. He did not satisfy the whims of ordinary citizens. He was recognized when he spoke on the subject of Bhagavatam, and he never attempted jugglery like a magician. Outwardly he appeared to be retarded, dumb, madman, but in fact he was the most elevated transcendental personality. Text 7. Katam vapandavayesya rajarsir munina saha samvadaha sambhutata yatraisa satvati shruti. How did it happen that King Parikshit met this great sage, making it possible for this great transcendental essence of the Vedas, Bhagavatam, to be sung to him? Purport. Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam is stated here as the essence of the Vedas. It is not an imaginary story as it is sometimes considered by unauthorized men. It is also called Shuka Samhita, or the Vedic hymn spoken by Sri Shukadeva Goswami, the great liberated sage. Text 8. Sagodonana matram hi griheshu griha madhinam avikshate mahabhagas tirti korvams tad ashramam. He, Shukadeva Goswami, was accustomed to stay at the door of a householder only long enough for a cow to be milked, and he did this just to sanctify the residence. Purport. Shukadeva Goswami met Emperor Parikshit and explained the text of Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. He was not accustomed to stay at any householder's residence for more than half an hour at the time of milking the cow, and he would just take the alms from the fortunate householder. That was to sanctify the residence by his auspicious presence. Therefore, Shukadeva Goswami is an ideal preacher established in the transcendental position. From his activities, those who are in the renounced order of life and dedicated to the mission of preaching the message of Godhead should learn that they have no business with householders, save and except to enlighten them in transcendental knowledge. Such asking for alms from the householder should be for the purpose of sanctifying his home. One who is in the renounced order of life should not be allured by the glamour of the householder's worldly possessions, and thus become subservient to worldly men. For one who is in the renounced order of life, this is much more dangerous than drinking poison and committing suicide. Text 9. Abhimanyu sutam suta prahur bhagavatotamam tasya janma mahascharyam karmani cha grinihina. It is said that Maharaj Parikshit is a great first-class devotee of the Lord, and that his birth and activities are all wonderful. Please tell us about him. Purport. The birth of Maharaj Parikshit is wonderful because in the womb of his mother, he was protected by the personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. His activities are also wonderful because he chastised Kali, who was attempting to kill a cow. To kill cows means to end human civilization. He wanted to protect the cow from being killed by the great representative of sin. His death is also wonderful because he got previous notice of his death, which is wonderful for any mortal being. And thus he prepared himself for passing away by sitting down on the bank of the Ganges and hearing the transcendental activities of the Lord. During all the days he heard Bhagavatam, he did not take food or drink, nor did he sleep a moment. So everything about him is wonderful, and his activities are worth hearing attentively. The desire is expressed herein to hear about him in detail. Text 10. Sasamratkasya vaheto panduna mana vardana prayopavishto gangayam andritya dirat shriyam. He was a great emperor and possessed all the opulences of his acquired kingdom. He was so exalted that he was increasing the prestige of the Pandu dynasty. Why did he give up everything to sit down on the bank of the Ganges and fast until death? Maharaj Parikshit was the emperor of the world and all the seas and oceans, and he did not have to take the trouble to acquire such a kingdom by his own effort. He inherited it from his grandfathers Maharaj Yudhishthir and brothers. Besides that, he was doing well in the administration and was worthy of the good names of his forefathers. Consequently, there was nothing undesirable in his opulence and administration. Then why should he give up all these favorable circumstances and sit down on the bank of the Ganges, fasting till death? This is astonishing, and therefore all were eager to know the cause. Text 11. Namanti yat pada niketam atmana shivaya haniya danhani satrava katam savira shriyam angadustyajam yuvai sato tristatum aho saha subi. He was such a great emperor that all of his enemies would come and bow down at his feet and surrender all their wealth for their own benefit. He was full of youth and strength, and he possessed kingly opulences that were difficult to give up. Why did he want to give up everything, including his life? Purport. There was nothing undesirable in his life. He was quite a young man and could enjoy life with power and opulence. So there was no question of retiring from active life. There was no difficulty in collecting the state taxes because he was so powerful and chivalrous that even his enemies would come to him and bow down at his feet and surrender all wealth for their own benefit. Maharaj Parikshit was a pious king. He conquered his enemies, and therefore the kingdom was full of prosperity. There was enough milk, grains, and metals, and all the rivers and mountains were full of potency. So materially everything was satisfactory. Therefore there was no question of untimely giving up his kingdom and life. The sages were eager to hear about all this. Text 12. Shivaya lokasya bhavaya bhutaye ya uttama shloka parayana jana jivantinat martam aso parashrayam numocha nirvidya kuta kalevaram. Those who are devoted to the cause of the personality of Godhead live only for the welfare, development, and happiness of others. They do not live for any selfish interest. So even though the Emperor Parikshit was free from all attachment to worldly possessions, how could he give up his mortal body, which was the shelter for others? Purport. Parikshit Maharaj was an ideal king and householder because he was a devotee of the personality of Godhead. A devotee of the Lord automatically has all good qualifications, and the emperor was a typical example of this. Personality, he had no attachment for all worldly opulences in his possessions. Personally, he had no attachment for all worldly opulences in his possession. But since he was king for all around welfare of his citizens, he was always busy in the welfare work of the public, not only for this life, but also for the next. He would not allow slaughterhouses or killing of cows. He was not a foolish, impartial administrator who would arrange for the protection of one living being and allow another to be killed. Because he was a devotee of the Lord, he knew perfectly well how to conduct his administration for everyone's happiness: men, animals, plants, and all living creatures. He was not selfishly interested. Selfishness is either self-centered or self-extended. He was neither. His interest was to please the supreme truth, the personality of Godhead. The king is the representative of the Supreme Lord, and therefore the king's interest must be identical with that of the Supreme Lord. The Supreme Lord wants all living beings to be obedient to him and thereby become happy. Therefore, the king's interest is to guide all subjects back to the kingdom of God. Hence, the activities of the citizens should be so coordinated that they can, at the end, go back home, back to Godhead. Under the administration of a representative king, the kingdom is full of opulence. At that time, human beings need not to eat animals. There are ample food, grains, milk, fruit, and vegetables, so that the human beings as well as the animals can eat sumptuously and to their heart's content. If all living beings are satisfied with food and shelter and obey the prescribed rules, there cannot be any disturbance between one living being and another. Emperor Parikshit was a worthy king, and therefore all were happy during his reign. Text 13. Tat sarvam na samakshakva prishto yad iha kinchana manye tvam vishaye vacham snatam anyatra chandasat. We know that you are expert in the meaning of all subjects, meaning some portions of the Vedas, and thus you can clearly explain the answers to all the questions we have just put to you. Purport. The difference between Vedas and the Puranas is like that between the Brahmanas and the Parivrajaka's. The Brahmanas are meant to administer some fruitive sacrifices mentioned in the Vedas, but the Parivrajakacharyas, or learned preachers, are meant to disseminate transcendental knowledge to one and all. As such, the Parivrajakacharyas are not always expert in pronouncing the Vedic mantras, which are practiced systematically by accent and meter by the Brahmanas, who are meant for administering Vedic rites. Yet it should not be considered that the Brahmanas are more important than the itinerant preachers. They are one and different simultaneously because they are meant for the same end in different ways. There is no difference also between the Vedic mantras and what is explained in the Puranas and Itihasas. According to Srila Jiva Goswami, it is mentioned in the Madhyanandina Shruti that all the Vedas, namely Sama, Atharva, Rig, Yajur, Puranas, Itihasas, Upanishads, etc., are emanations from the breathing of the Supreme Being. The only difference is that the Vedic mantras are mostly begun with pranava omkara, and it requires some training to practice the meter pronunciation of the Vedic mantras. But that does not mean that Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam is of less importance than Vedic mantras. On the contrary, it is the ripened fruit of all the Vedas, as stated before. Besides that, the most perfectly liberated soul, Srila Shukadeva Goswami, is absorbed in the studies of Bhagavatam, although he is already self-realized. Srila Sutta Goswami is following in his footsteps, and therefore his position is not the least less important, because he was not expert in chanting Vedic mantras with meteric pronunciation, which depends more on practice than actual realization. Realization is more important than parrot-like chanting. Text 14. Sutta uvacha dvapare samuna prapte tritihe yuga paryaye jata para sarad yogi Vashavyam kalaya hare. Sutta Goswami said, when the second millennium overlapped the third, the great sage Vyasadeva was born to Parasara, in the womb of Satyavati, the daughter of Vasu. Purport. There is a chronological order of the four millenniums, namely Satya, Dwarpa, Treta, and Kali, but sometimes there is overlapping. During the regime of Vaivasvata Manu, there was an overlapping of the 28th round of the four millenniums, and the third millennium appeared prior to the second. In that particular millennium, Lord Sri Krishna also descends, and because of this, there was some particular alteration. The mother of the great sage was Satyavati, the daughter of Vasu, a fisherman, and the father was the great Parasara Muni. That is the history of Vyasadev's birth. Every millennium is divided into 3 periods, and each period is called a sandhya. Vyasadeva appeared in the third sandhya of that particular age. And thus ends our reading for today. We'll continue from text 15 on Monday. All glories to Om Vishnupad Srila Bhakti Nirmala Acharya Maharaj Ki Jai. All glories to Om Vishnupad Shripad Bhakti Madhava Puri Maharaj Ki Jai. All glories to our Rupanuga Guru Varga Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees Ki Jai. All glories to Shripad Bhakti Niskam Shanta Maharaj Ki Jai. All glories to Shripad Bhakti Vigyan Muni Maharaj Ki Jai. All glories to Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai, the worldwide devotees Ki Jai. All glories to Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. All glories to Navadvip Dham Ki Jai. All glories to Giri Govardhan Gupta Govardhan Dham Ki Jai. Jai Tulsi Devi Ki Jai. Nitai Gora Hari Hari Bol.